love that seems perfect is not always so. Sometimes there is something more behind the smiles, and behind the pleasant words a future betrayal. He had found his love, but he had no idea that this woman would one day destroy his life. When George saw Susan for the first time, he was just over 30. He was just starting to build a career as a financial advisor, had a nice house in the suburbs, and thought his life was just beginning. Susan was a few years younger, sophisticated, smiling, and damn, she was extremely charming. They met at a party at a mutual friend's house. She knew how to listen and laughed at his jokes. Susan's eyes shone with sincerity, and her voice had a softness that instantly swept George off his feet. I've always dreamed of a man who knows what he wants from life," she said that evening when they were sitting on the terrace, leaving the noisy company behind. George thought he had finally found his man. Everything was developing rapidly. A year later they got married. 2 years later they moved into a spacious house, and then came the children. A life resembled a classic American dream: work, home, weekends with a large group of friends, trips on vacation. But something was wrong. It seemed to George that Susan sometimes became completely different. She'd be gentle and caring one day and cold and distant the next. She could easily manipulate people, get what she wanted without any effort, and always knew how to make him give in. Darling, I know you're the smartest, but maybe you should listen to me," she would ask in her honeyed voice. George sometimes jokingly called her Little Fox. But foxes are good not only for their cunning, but also for their ability to survive at the expense of others. As time went on, George began to notice things he hadn't noticed before. Susan had impeccable taste, but all their big purchases were always her decisions. She didn't work, but she knew how to manage the family budget. George did not want to believe that he was living with the wrong person. After all, over the years, she had supported him in difficult moments, always been there for him, and never let him lose heart. There was only one thing that worried him. She never looked scared or vulnerable. Nothing could throw her off balance. It was as if she always knew what was coming next, and if George had listened to his inner voice then, he might have avoided the worst. But he had no idea that very soon his life would be turned upside down. And then came the day he would remember for the rest of his life. The day he found out that the woman he trusted with everything had been playing her own game for a long time. I hope you find this story interesting. Your feedback, suggestions, and subscriptions are always welcome, though a divorce is always painful. But when you find out that you've been living a lie all these years, that your money, your home, everything you've built doesn't belong to you anymore, the pain becomes almost unbearable. George thought it would be a simple breakup, but he could not have imagined that Susan had something worse in store for him. It was supposed to be a normal day. He came home from work a little early, brought Susan her favorite coffee, and heard a calm response: "We need to have a serious talk." The tone of her voice was not just cold. It was icy. It took George a few seconds to realize what he had heard. "I want a divorce." 3 words. Just 3 words, and the world he had been building for almost 5 decades disappeared into the abyss. He thought it would be civilized. Let's say goodbye, divide the property, everyone will go their separate ways. But no. A few days later, George received documents from her lawyer. Susan demanded the house, a large portion of his retirement savings, and even the account where he had been saving money for the children. George sat in his lawyer's office, trying to understand how this was possible. "But this is wrong!" he exploded. "She hasn't worked all these years." The lawyer just sighed. "She did everything right, George. She's done the right thing, George." He felt sick. She planned it. George tried to negotiate. He still had hope that Susan would change her mind, that she would realize how cruel it was. And then he saw her. It was an evening in a restaurant. She was wearing a dress he had bought for her, and next to her was a young man who was clearly not just a friend. She was laughing. She looked happy. And George was sitting in the car, looking at it all through the windshield, clenching his fists. She had taken almost everything from him, but it wasn't over yet. George decided that he would not let it go. When you lose everything, it seems like the world is falling apart and there is no way out. George was at rock bottom, betrayal, divorce, financial ruin. But even in the darkest moments, sometimes there is a ray of hope. The only question is whether you can see it. A few weeks passed. George was living in a cheap motel because his house no longer belonged to him. He tried to pull himself together, but every day was like hell. One day, he was sitting in a bar, the same place where he and Susan had once celebrated their anniversary. It was ironic, wasn't it? He was twirling a glass of whiskey in his hands when he heard a familiar voicing, "George, is that you?" He looked up and saw a man he hadn't seen in decades. Standing before him was Mike, an old friend with whom he had once worked together on a construction site. They had once been inseparable, but life had scattered them in different directions. "My George, you look like you've just been run over by a train." Mike sat down next to him and ordered a beer. George sighed. He almost did. They got to talking. George told him everything about Susan, about the divorce, about the money she had taken from him. Mike's eyes grew angry. "Dude, didn't you see she was using you?" Mike took a nervous sip of his beer. George shrugged his shoulders. "I thought we were in true love." Mike shook his head. "No, man, it's not love. This is manipulation. And if you don't get a grip now, she'll be dancing over your gravestone." It turned out that Mike was well aware of people like Susan. "I've met women like that. They calculate everything to the smallest detail. Turn on a man, and when he is most vulnerable, they hit him where it hurts. And most importantly, they never stop." George thought about it. "Do you think she's cooking something else?" Mike snorted. "You bet she is. People like her always have a plan B." For the first time in a long time, George felt anger. But not the kind that destroys, but the kind that empowers. If Susan thinks she's won, she's very much mistaken. Revenge is a dish served cold. But George was not going to wait. She took everything from him, his money, his home, even his dignity. But he found a way to strike back. And this blow had to be such that Susan would not be able to recover. The Mike put the phone in front of him. "Here's everything you need to know." George looked at the screen. His heart was pounding. And it was all about Susan, her finances, her business dealings, even the secret expenses she'd been hiding from the court. "Where did you get this?" Mike smiled. "My friend, I work in a field where such things are easy to find. And do you know what's interesting? She's already got her eye on a new victim." George felt anger boiling inside him. "And who is it?" Mike turned the screen around. The photo showed a young man in an expensive suit, 30-something, with a white, smiling face. It was Henry Douglas, a successful lawyer, rich, self-confident, and completely unaware of the trap he had fallen into. George clenched his fists tightly. "Okay. If she thinks she can just move on to the next one, I'm going to make her regret it." He began to develop a plan. First, he had to find out how far Susan's relationship with Henry had gone. And I had a second. He had to find her weakness. Thanks to Mike's information, he learned that Susan had hidden some of her assets during the divorce. This meant that the court documents could be re-examined. But most importantly, he had to make her believe that she was still in control. George didn't wait around. He went to the club where Susan often appeared. He hadn't seen her in months, but as soon as she walked into the room, everything in him tightened. She was the same confident bold, with the same predatory look, and she wasn't even surprised to see him. "George, I didn't think you'd dare come here." He just smiled. "Life's not over yet, dear." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" George leaned closer. Did you know that the court can reconsider a divorce case if it turns out that one of the parties has hidden assets?" For a second, her smile disappeared. "What do you mean by that?" George shrugged his shoulders. I just think your new life might be over sooner than you planned." Susan always thought she was the smartest, but this time she was wrong. She thought he was broken, that he would just disappear. But George was playing a long game, and his first move was to make Susan realize that she had lost control. Henry Douglas was sitting in his office, reviewing documents, when his secretary told him that a man had come to see him. He said it was urgent, she explained. Henry sighed. Okay, let him come in. George entered the office, calm, confident, with a slight smile on his face. Mr. Douglas, nice to meet you. Do we know each other? No, but you know my ex-wife, Susan, very well. At this point, Henry's face changed. What do you want? George sat down across from him. I just want to help you not to make the same mistake I did. Henry listened to George tell his story, about the love that turned into a trap, the years of marriage that ended in betrayal, the divorce in which he lost everything. Do you really think you're special to her? George asked calmly. Henry tried to keep a straight face, but his eyes were uncertain. You just want to tarnish her, me, denigrate her. George laughed. No, Mr. Douglas. I just want you to know who you're dealing with. He put a folder on the table. Here's something interesting. The money she forgot to declare during the divorce, and a few other little things you might find interesting. Henry looked at the documents, and his expression hardened. What do you want? George stood up. Just take a closer look at it, and when the moment comes, make the right choice. Henry opened the folder. His hands were trembling a little. He had no idea that very soon his life would change forever. Susan was enjoying her life. She had money, a new home, and a powerful husband. She believed that the past was behind her, but behind her back, then threads of revenge were already being woven. Susan woke up in a luxurious mansion in a prestigious neighborhood. The sun was gently shining through the expensive curtains, and a glass of freshly squeezed juice was already waiting on the bedside table. The servant knew her morning habits, when she glanced at the luxurious watch on her wrist, a gift from Henry. Oh, how good it is to live right, she thought. Susan rolled over, saw her husband still sleeping, and smiled smugly. Henry Douglas was wealthy, naive in love. He gave her everything, and most importantly, he believed in her sincerity. She stood up and went to the mirror. Well, Susan, she said to her reflection, you've won again. The day was spent on breakfast with friends, buying a new bracelet, going to the beautician, and in the evening, dinner with her husband. Henry was acting a little unusual. He was polite, even attentive, but Susan felt something elusive. Is everything okay, darling? She asked, playing the role of the perfect wife. Yes, darling, he smiled, but his eyes betrayed some tension. Strange, Susan thought. But she quickly dismissed her doubts. Perhaps it was work-related. Or maybe he was preparing a surprise. She didn't know that Henry had received the file from George. And that from that moment on, her every move was being carefully analyzed. While Susan was drinking expensive wine in a restaurant, George was reviewing documents in his rented apartment. His plan was progressing. He called a private detective he knew. I need you to follow her. All meetings, all calls. I want to know when she makes the first wrong move. She already has George, he replied. But you want more, don't you? George smiled. A thorough one. I want her to not realize when things started to fall apart. The next morning, Susan would discover a small change in her perfect life. At first, it's nothing. But that's how the collapse begins. All the threads that were woven around my revenge finally came together in one vivid picture. It was the moment when I gathered all the evidence, all the little things that testified to the betrayal, and now, leaving no room for doubt, I decided to speak out. All the years I spent collecting facts, planning every step, finally led me to this moment, to the final act, when the truth must be revealed. I gathered all the documents, emails, bank statements, everything that proved she had been deceiving me for decades. Every piece of paper, every word, reminded me of those countless nights when I lay there, not knowing if I could forgive, if I could forget. But now I could no longer remain silent, and I had to speak up, even if it meant destroying everything she had built. The plan was carefully crafted. I knew that betrayal should not go unanswered, so I decided it was time to act. In the shadowy office, under the light of only one lamp, I opened an old folder that I had never opened before. There were numerous letters, photographs, phone records, everything that testified to her double life. I carefully reread every page, every word, and felt like my entire past was coming together into a single whole that I could finally show the world. These proofs were not just documents, they were evidence that my trust had been betrayed repeatedly. They spoke for themselves. And I decided that it was time to share them with everyone who had been deceived just like me. Eli, it's time to show that even when all seems lost, the truth always finds its way to the surface. This is not just about revenge, it's about justice. I started working on my plan, involving several reliable specialists. I'm a private detective, a lawyer, financial experts, each of them had their own piece of the puzzle that I had to put together. They all worked for the same goal, to prove that she had manipulated me, that she had taken everything from me that I should never have lost. We gathered all the evidence into one big case. My plan was to file a lawsuit that would not only prove her betrayal, but also pave the way for me to get back all the money and property I had lost. But that was not my only plan. I decided to use the information I found to expose all her secrets, the dark sides she never wanted to talk about, and then seemed to be forced to answer for everything. I knew that this step would change everything. In my office, where cold lamps cast shadows on the walls, I sat with my lawyer. We were going through all the documents we had collected, every piece of evidence, every detail that could support my case. I was amazed at the level of preparation. She had carefully hidden everything, but mistakes always happen. The last thread connecting her lies was thin, but I found it. The lawyer said, "Your evidence is extremely strong. The court can make a decision that will give you back not only justice, but also a part of what you have lost." I listened, but my thoughts were flying around in my head. Not just about the money. My thoughts were about everything she had destroyed: our trust, our life together, everything we had built together. But now it was time to settle the score. The day of the trial came. When I entered the courtroom, my heart was beating as if it could be torn apart. Everyone was there, my family, friends, even those who had once supported her. All eyes were on me. I sat there holding the folders of evidence. Every document, every word I read was proof that she was not who they thought she was. The judge was asking questions, the lawyers were arguing, and I was just looking ahead, knowing that this moment would be the turning point. And I felt that every second was increasing the tension. And so, when the case reached its climax, I stood up and addressed the courtroom. I asked for justice. I asked for the truth to be revealed for the last time. My words echoed through the room, leaving everyone silent. And then the judge announced a decision that was to change everything. After the trial, I left the building, not knowing whether this was the end of my struggle or the beginning of a new stage. People on the street said it was a great victory. But for me, it was more than just money or property. It was a victory over all the lies that had been going on for years. I found my liberation, my justice. But the question remaining, what next? Who among us has really changed? Will this be the end or just the beginning of a real new life? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next episode will reveal the answers, but perhaps leave even more questions. The judge announced the decision, and the room exploded into whispers. Someone breathed a sigh of relief, someone looked at each other in surprise, and she stood there as if in a stupor, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. But there was no way out. I had won. But what happened next? I stood in front of the courthouse, holding the documents in my hands. The lawyer clapped me on the shoulder and said, "It was a brilliant game. Now she will get what she deserves." I nodded, but something was gnawing at me inside. I thought that after all this I would feel better, that I would be able to breathe a sigh of relief. But the feeling of victory was bitter. Yes, I got some of the money back. I proved her lies to the whole world. But what now? Has it changed me? Was revenge worth all these years? The next day I received a message. She wanted to meet. "We need to talk," she wrote. I hesitated, but something pushed me to answer. "Anna, we met in a small cafe where we used to go on dates." Now it was not a romantic place, but a battlefield without weapons. She was sitting across from me, nervously clutching a cup of coffee. She looked at me with eyes that no longer contained arrogance, no longer had that predatory glint that she used to have. "Do you really hate me?" Her voice was trembling. I looked into her face and did not recognize the woman I had once loved. "No," I answered after a pause, "but I won't let you destroy me anymore." She lowered her head. "I have lost everything," she whispered. I could have said that it was her own fault, that it was her greed and betrayal that led to this. But I just kept quiet, because had she really lost more than me? I returned home. For the first time in years, this house no longer seemed empty. I walked through the rooms, touching things that had been here since the time we were together. Once this house was filled with her laughter, her voice. Now it was my territory, my personal space where there was no more room for the past. I opened a bottle of whiskey, poured myself a glass, and sat down in a chair by the fireplace. And for the first time in a long time I felt silence, not emptiness, but exactly silence, and I realized that it was finally over. But what comes next? Is this the real end, or the beginning of a new life? Will I be able to trust someone again? Will I ever find true love again? These questions were running through my head, but now I was not afraid of them. I was not afraid of the future. I raised my glass and whispered it, "To a new beginning." Because life does not end, even when it seems that you have lost everything. I sat on a park bench watching the sun slowly disappear behind the horizon. The air was saturated with the chill of autumn, and children were laughing somewhere nearby. Life went on. But what did it mean for me? Everything I had built over the years had fallen apart. Everything I thought was mine belonged to another person. Everything I believed in turned out to be a lie. I took revenge. I got what I wanted. But then what? I thought that when she got what she deserved, I would feel better. That I would be able to turn the page and not look back. But the past wouldn't let go. I could say that I have no regrets. But is it really true? I lost not only my wife. I lost a part of myself. That naive faith in people that I once had. Now I knew that I could only trust myself. But did that mean I was doomed to be alone? The phone vibrated in my pocket. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello? Hello? It's me." I froze. A voice I would recognize among 1,000. A voice that had been a part of my life for so many years. It's her. "What do you want?" I just wanted to know how you were doing. I wanted to answer sharply, to say that I didn't care anymore. But instead I asked, "How are you?" She sighed. "I'm alive." Just like that. I'm alive. Before, I would have said that this call was an attempt to fix everything. That she was sorry, that she wanted to talk, to explain. But I was no longer the kind of person who clung to the past. "I don't know what you want," I said. "Neither do I," she replied. "I just thought." She didn't finish her sentence. I didn't need to hear any more explanations. Because now I knew the decision was mine. I pressed end call and put the phone in my pocket. This chapter of my life is closed. But did that mean it was the end? Or perhaps it was the beginning of something new. I got up from the bench and walked forward, not knowing what was waiting for me around the corner. But for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories ahead that will make you think. I hope you find this story interesting. Your feedback, suggestions, and subscriptions are always welcome.